The knife of Celestine's voice cut through the candles and conversation before the plates were cleared. It was thin and certain, practiced like a ritual. "Give me the ring back," she said, not as a question but as a verdict. For a moment every sound in the dining room slotted into a single frequency. The silverware's soft scrape, the low clink of ice and crystal, the murmured approval of guests who had come to witness a family performance. Zuri sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap, the linen napkin creased into a small, careful square beneath them. She felt the cotton between her fingers like an anchor. Malik, flushed from the wine and the soft applause for a speech he'd just finished, smiled in the way men smile when other people's admiration confirms a story they tell themselves. He did not move. Adzi, perched in the chair that had once been Zuri's, leaned forward with bright eyes and that half-earnest laugh she used like lacquer on everything she touched. The room expected a scene, a protest, a snatch, a slap of scandal to be dished up alongside the salad. Celestine's hand hovered in the air for a moment as if she might pluck the ring off a finger. She did not reach. She had rehearsed the incantation, the demand, the collective intake of breath, the slow, gleeful calculation that would follow. Humiliation is a public art. It requires audience, timing, and above all, conviction. Zuri looked down and remembered the weight of the small ring. The simple band Malik had pressed on her finger on a rooftop 10 years earlier, back when the city still smelled of newly paved asphalt and their ambitions sounded like an honest plan. She remembered the quiet way Mama Odessa had kissed the knuckle of that same hand once, years before, when Zuri had left for marriage. Odessa had said nothing about the ring itself. She had looked instead at Zuri's eyes, and in that look there had been a lesson that would outlast any spoken admonition. Keep your ledgers. Learn the slow patience of money. Do not let loud people rewrite what you have done in one breath. Celestine repeated the instruction as if she were placing a deed in front of everyone. "Hand it over," she said, and leaned back, satisfied by the gravity she had conjured. The guests adjusted in their seats, some hiding smiles, some pretending shock. Cameras for shows that covered society dinners would have loved this frame. The young wife rendered invisible, the confident matriarch reclaiming what, by all appearances, was within her grasp. It was neat. Zuri's fingers found the inside rim of the ring and rolled it gently between skin and bone. She thought of the small stitches Mama Odessa had taught her to notice, the seam of accounts, a forgotten certificate in a glove box, the curved edge of a title deed. She thought of how her grandmother liked to say that symbols are thin things. They can be taken in a gust. What matters is the soil where the roots go. For a moment she allowed the taste of something metallic and learned to pass as simply, an old practice from years of hiding her proficiency until the moment its revelation would be useful. She smiled because she remembered who she was. The smile was small and invisible to most. Mr. Clifton, who occupied the head of the table with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to documents, watched Zuri with an expression that was not pity but bookkeeping, understanding where the numbers lay. He had been in the room once as an advisor before the bond between family facade and financial reality had been tested. Tonight he sat nearly impassive, hands folded as if to say that nothing of consequence would be sorted in a moment of theater. Yet the night had already begun to stack itself into the ledger of what was to come. Across the table, Celestine made the mistake of thinking the ring was the story. In her mind it was proof. She had the arc of the narrative memorized. Her son was replaced. Someone else had taken his history and presented it polished. The ring, symbol of that history, would be returned and the order restored. She could see, as she had seen many times, the image of her family's prestige in polished frames and magazine spreads. She could not see, or did not want to, that prestige had always been complicated by the quiet accrual of other kinds of power, those that do not announce themselves at dinner. The guest shifted. A woman 2 seats down tucked a napkin to her lips as if to stop a laugh. A man at the corner table glanced at his watch as if to check the tempo of scandal. Someone murmured to their neighbor about rumors of Malik's new ventures. The conversation began to tilt toward the story Celestine wanted to tell. Zuri reached for her glass, not to drink but to steady her hand, and felt the chill of the stem travel up her skin. She had learned to do this at nights when the children slept. when the house's newest lines of silence creaked into place. She kept her voice low. "If you think a ring can hold history, then you misunderstand what holds it," she said, and the sentence landed like a coin on the table. Small, hard, impossible to unhear even if people tried. It was not a defense. It was a fact. Celestine's expression faltered for the slightest instant, an aperture in an otherwise well-maintained face. Her eyes narrowed. Celestine was not used to having a counterpoint. She preferred oppositions that collapsed elegantly into her will. She had come to collect. She had not expected to be interrogated by quiet competence. The moment that might have exploded into vitriol did not. Instead, it spread thin like oil on water, visible, slippery, and stopping the fire from taking hold. Malik laughed then, his voice edged with annoyance, and offered a toast to a future unbothered by petty claims. The room cheered and the world moved on, parceled and neat. If this is grabbing you, stay with the story. There is a moment coming that will make everyone look back twice. After the guests left and the house sighed into its small private after-hours, Zuri carried a plate into the kitchen with hands that did not tremble. She set the plate down, rinsed it, and then opened a drawer where a leather-bound book lay wrapped in oilcloth. The cover was worn, the spine softened by years of being pressed between other things. It was Mama Odessa's journal, more ledger than diary, more map than confession. It smelled faintly of tobacco and the red clay that had been their land's breath for generations. The journal was not sentimental. Mama Odessa had not written adorned phrases. She had written names, dates, certificates, the cadence of interest payments, the way a trustee might be replaced without fanfare. Zuri's grandmother had been a woman who took the long view. She kept no dramatic instructions about revenge or public theater. Her language was practical. Open when necessary, close when not. Do not let pride make you reckless. She had left Zuri a sealed envelope. For when you need to stand, it read in her handwriting, and a map of where certain deeds had been hidden in plain sight. Small parcels, legacy trusts, a series of professional relationships that would look like nothing to those who only wanted headlines. Zuri ran a finger down the page that listed a string of corporate names, the kind of alphabet soup that makes people look away because it feels too dry. To her, the names were not dry, they were threads. Her grandmother had been careful in life and acutely practical in how she built a chain that would not be easily seen. Where Celestine saw jewelry and rituals, Mama Odessa had quietly purchased infrastructure. The early years of Zuri and Malik's marriage had been porous to his ambitions. He had a talent for telling good stories about small projects that became appetizing to investors. Zuri had watched him stand under bright lights and sketch futures on cocktail napkins. She had liked him because he asked big questions and because he believed in work that created change. She had, quietly and intentionally, put money into his ventures when he could not yet attract the right kind of capital. She did not make announcements. She concentrated on the mechanics. An account opened here, a shell company established there, the slow accretion of shares, the appointment of officers who would act on paper, but not in rumor. It had always been a deliberate choice. Allow him to have the spotlight. Let him believe the story was written by his own charm. Her name appeared nowhere in glossy profiles, and that invisibility suited both of them until it did not. It suited him because he thrived on applause. It suited her because she had learned from Odessa that power is useful precisely when it can move without announcing itself. In the years that followed, Malik learned to walk in other rooms. The rooms where vanity was a currency, where trophies were props, where someone else's smile could be parked temporarily and then discarded. Adzi arrived as a bright new accessory to the narrative. She laughed loudly at the right moments, wore pearls like stage props, and never asked complicated questions about where money came from or how deals were structured. Celestine loved her for this. She loved her for the simplicity of her appetite. The slow erosion began as small slippages, Malik's longer stays at other houses, missed calls, an invitation to another woman's opening that had once been his to share with Zuri. The more Malik learned to savor the public role of the accomplished husband, the less he noticed the scaffolding that made that stage steady. Zuri watched the scenes rearrange. School assemblies where Adzi sat in Zuri's place. Holiday photos where Zuri's smile was carefully edited to the background. She watched with the anatomist's eye. Here is a tendon moved, a social muscle reoriented. The person in the chair changes, but the structure that runs behind it does not need to. When the first legal papers arrived, filed by an attorney whose letterhead gave an artificial glow to the process, they were both a surprise and something Zuri had prepared for. The filing was the kind that used family language to sound like necessity. A petition for custody review, an interim request for the children's schooling to be reconsidered in the interest of stability. It was not vicious in the way a tabloid wants to hear. It was clinical, polite even. Its power lay in the motion itself, a cascade that would require responses, counsel, social proof. It would demand energy and attention and perhaps a willingness to be seen as unstable. That had been the plan. Malik's first reaction was indignation. His second was to rely on his mother to narrate the damage. Celestine moved with the efficiency of a social surgeon, producing witnesses, offering statements, arranging for a private investigator who would not ask too many inconvenient questions. Garrett was good at finding details. He was comfortable digging through phone logs, social pages, small business records. He called it work. Celestine called it restoration. When Garrett's report came back to Celestine, it was presented with the kind of flourish a man uses to make a small discovery look like a breakthrough. He had pictures of late-night meetings, screenshots of messages, receipts that told a believable story. It was the kind of dossier that can change dinner conversations and, more importantly, make other people act. Neighbors, donors, school boards. Zuri read the redacted summaries as if they were the weather. They described conditions but did not create them. Zuri did not fling herself at the papers. She sat on the back steps of the house that had once belonged to her grandmother, and for the first time in weeks opened Mama Odessa's sealed envelope. Odessa's handwriting was precise, a hand trained on ledgers and seed catalogs. The instruction was not dramatic. When you have been miscounted, count again. Do not trade your steadiness for someone else's story. Those words were a calm command. Zuri did what Odessa suggested. She began to take inventory. Inventory is a quiet art. It favors those who count small things and do not require applause for the count. Zuri cataloged bank accounts, trusts, directorships her grandmother had installed under other names as a means of protection. She sat with Mr. Clifton and asked precise questions. Who held the vote proxies? What were the terms of the trust? Which entities required public disclosure in case of a corporate event? Mr. Clifton, who had seen many houses explode into sunlight because they were not anchored by paper, advised that discretion would be essential. Public reaction could be swift, but structural shifts move by filings and signatures, by recalls and reappointments. He promised to be discreet, to prepare the necessary instruments to ensure that when a motion was needed, it would be procedural and irrevocable. Zuri did not want fireworks. She wanted the administrative thing, the lever that when pulled would cause a cascade of institutional changes, board votes recalled, funding runs redirected, the polite scaffolding upon which Malik's reputation rested to be removed in ways that would not lend themselves to melodrama. She thought of Mama Odessa's fields in Georgia, where fences did not appear suddenly. They were installed by a person who understood seasons and erosion, and made choices that lasted beyond a single lifetime. The weeks that followed resembled a slow tightening of threads. Garrett, working for Celestine, turned over a lot of dirt, but could find no one person who floated like a head of the chain. Where he expected a single signature, he found an array of accounts and agents, names that hinted at a web but not its center. He reported what he had found with the arrogance of someone who expects to be rewarded with the narrative of discovery. Celestine read the reports and found them incomplete. She wanted to see who to claim victory over. The absence of a single easy mark made her irritation deepen. In private, Malik roughed his hands through his hair and called Zuri to complain, as if she had control over the kitchenware of his life. Sometimes his voice carried the bewilderment of a man who had always been told he was the protagonist and was now discovering a co-author who had edited quietly for years. Zuri listened. She did not make vows. She only took the calls at the time she thought best and returned to the ledger. At night she would sit by the window and trace the map of the holdings in her head. The names of shell companies did not thrill her. They were rather the arithmetic of stability. She could imagine the way trustees would sign off on a recall, the way a secretary might receive a certified letter and, according to established rule, effect a change on a corporate registry. She schemed not with fury but with patience, understanding that a true unmaking of a social order is often simply the reversal of the paperwork that created it. An administrative death, slow and unglamorous, but lasting. There were moments when the mind wanted theater. The late-night calls from friends who urged public statements, the columnists sniffing at a scandal, the attorneys who promised that actions in the court of public opinion would make courts move faster. These voices proliferated like infestation. Zuri turned them away. She had learned from Odessa that spectacle can be a cheap substitute for strategy. A well-executed document can do what a shout cannot, make the world change in ways that do not depend on fury. Garrett, for all his thoroughness, had missed the essential thing, a name on a ledger that would tie everything to a single owner. He reported things that smelled like power, a trust that funneled dividends to a foundation, a land grant that produced consistent rental income, a series of consulting contracts that moved money in neat, unremarkable envelopes. He did not see what Odessa had built because he was not looking for root system. He was looking for the visible crown. When Zuri met with Mr. Clifton the week after the dinner, she carried the leather journal like a map. Clifton moved in his chair with the ease of someone who had been taught to enjoy a slow victory. He had been Mr. Odessa's counsel once upon a time, and had the record of signatures and appointments that would make a proper reorientation possible. "You understand what this will do?" he asked, not as a warning but as a measurement of intent. "I do," Zuri replied. Her voice was steady. The thing she measured against was not a trophy but a set of responsibilities. What would be owed to employees, to trust beneficiaries, to institutions that had done business with the entities Mama Odessa had assembled. There would be consequences that did not make good tabloid copy. Accountants realigning balance sheets, trustees replaced in quiet conferences, grants withdrawn and rerouted to different purposes. It would be effective in a way that couldn't be undone by a retraction or a press release. It would be administrative and therefore permanent. Mr. Clifton nodded and began to instruct his clerk to assemble the documents, to prepare proxies, to contact a registrar. He used the language of procedure. Zuri felt the satisfaction of seeing instruments take the place of impulse. She did not think of revenge. She thought of reallocation, channels redirected toward sustainable projects Odessa had cared about, education on the land trust work for communities that had been parceled out by earlier generations. She had ideas that read less like punishment and more like correction of a miscount. The legal ripples began quietly. Notices were prepared, not for spectacle, but for effect. A foundation's funds might be directed to new trustees. A lender would be asked to review the architect of credit lines. Board members would be contacted and presented with a certified filing. Each step could be explained with phrases so dry they did not suggest drama. Due diligence, corporate resolution, recall of appointment. The work was tedious. It was also irreversible in ways that a furious speech rarely is. Meanwhile, Celestine escalated in the only currency she truly believed in, social judgment. She hosted luncheons where Malik's infidelity became a cautionary tale and where the ring was brandished as evidence. She spoke to friends in the right places. She called in favors. The social machine aligned. A rumor flared here. A photographer was guided there. She felt with a righteous ache that she was restoring an order that had been disturbed. Zuri let people be loud. She dealt with facts. She met with Dr. Lenora Owe when it became necessary. Lenora, who chaired a philanthropic board and had an ear for institutional reputations. Lenora's questions were precise and non-judgmental. She asked Zuri what she would do with power if given it, whether she wanted to preserve the family name or repurpose it. Zuri's answer was a map of possible redirections. Scholarships for girls, a fund to support single mothers returning to work, an endowment for land stewardship. Lenora's eyes, which had seen many institutions redirect after a scandal, softened in a way that suggested an ally was being formed rather than an enemy being made. Celestine did not notice the subtle coalition gathering on the margins. She was busy arranging public scenes and inviting cameras. Adzi, who thrived on being seen, posted pictures with children and champagne and the right kind of smile that reads like an ad. She did not notice the small letters because small letters do not populate the same feeds as glamour. Garrett continued to do the only thing he had been asked to do: find the visible evidence. He sent Celestine a thick envelope of images and invoices, and the sort of narrative that would convince a nervous donor. Celestine read it and passed it along as if sealing some victory. The envelope had weight and smell and the satisfaction of having fought. She had not expected and therefore could not imagine that what she demanded in the dining room would be the outward sign of a contest that had unfolded in documents for years. Zuri's children, who had watched the dinner through a crack between a stair and a door, were safe from the larger motion by the simplicity of their needs: a bedtime story, a scraped knee mended, a song hummed at the sink. Zuri held them close that night in the small practical way she had always held them, with food in the pantry, school fees accounted for, a space set aside in the will. The small things are not small to children. The house settled and the ledger work continued. Zuri's actions were not grand. They were procedural shifts that required time to settle into place. She set meeting dates rather than statements. She signed papers that made certain boards aware of pending votes, and she authorized communications that would, when read by the right people, prompt movement. It was not flashy. It would be effective. There were small, almost comical moments of dissonance. Malik, who had gotten used to being the one applauded in public, called late one night and demanded a public alliance, a statement that they would weather this together. He spoke of house, of children, of image, as if the sequence of his life was still written in the ink he preferred. Zuri answered by asking him who he had appointed to be his references and whether his investors knew of the risks that social scandals sometimes created. He did not like the question. He hung up. Zuri felt nothing akin to sudden triumph. Her actions were not intended to humiliate. They were meant to recalibrate what was owed where. The day she instructed Mr. Clifton to place formal holds on certain discretionary funds, she felt only the cool righteousness of someone who had dispatched a task done correctly. She made no speech. She prepared notices in technical language that read like the beginning of a series of administrative moves. She penned a letter to Celestine, composed of calm sentences, notifying her of changes to accounts and trustees, written without flourish, but with clarity that would sting because it was methodical. Celestine, for the first time since she had demanded the ring, found that her dramatic gestures had placed the stage but not the orchestra. She had thrown a spotlight and found that the thing she had aimed for was a silhouette of a much deeper arrangement. Her allies began to squint at ledgers. She asked Garrett to dig more. Garrett, for all his effort, found in the paper trail the kind of things which would embarrass in private and annoy in public: hotel receipts, an unpaid contractor here and there, but nothing that tied the entire story together into the clean conquest she craved. The pivot that would change the evening of celebration to an evening of reckoning was not yet in place. Zuri had made her moves in small, surgical ways, preparing instruments that would bite in quiet administrative fashion. She had begun to redirect where grants would be sent and to inform certain boards that an audit would be forthcoming. She had prepared communications to be released in the event that someone attempted a public spectacle. The law of slow tides had been set in motion, and yet the world outside the ledger continued to hum with appetite. Malik scheduled a gala, public and glossy, a night to celebrate his newest triumph, surrounded by the people who had loved the story he told. He posted the photos, and Adzi rehearsed her smile. Celestine breathed deep and imagined the final image. Her son triumphant, the woman who had displaced her son's wife seated in the place of honor, the ring a symbol returned or reclaimed. Zuri received the invitation to the gala the same day she signed the final proxy documents. It arrived in an envelope thick with expectation and the right kind of paper. She read it slowly, feeling the weight of the paper in her hands, and understood both the risk and the opportunity. A room full of cameras and applause could be messy. It could also be where a carefully placed fact could change a narrative. She considered declining. Instead, she folded the invitation and placed it within the journal, beneath the page that listed the chain of entities Mama Odessa had created. At dusk, she walked the property line of the old land in Georgia in her mind, the red clay beneath her feet as solid as any signature. She thought of the way Odessa had walked that field one afternoon and told her simply, "You will not be counted by how loud you are. You will be counted by what you keep." Zuri closed the journal on that thought, feeling the leather give under her palms. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more exact, the sensation of a plan that had reached its gears and begun to turn. There would be a gala with all its glitter. There would be toasts and a video about Malik's supposed genius. There would be cameras pointed at a chair. But threads had been pulled, and when the room looked for a person to blame, it would find that what had been sought with a demand had already been purchased in full by the very person they had tried to render invisible. Outside, the city held its breath in the small way cities do before a storm. Inside, Zuri sat at the kitchen table and wrote a short note to the children, folding it into their lunchboxes as if nothing more notable than a parent's love had happened. Then she dialed Mr. Clifton, and when he answered, she said only, "Make ready." He replied with the kind of low, procedural voice of a man who understood that the most powerful things are sometimes merely the right papers in the right order. On the marble under the lamp, the leather journal was a quiet, low object, heavy with what had been saved and made precise. Zuri ran a thumb over the cover and let the room settle around her, the mundane sounds the world offers after displays. Dishwasher humming, a faint radio in another room, the night's hush. She felt the steadiness of someone who knew how to wait. The next morning, Celestine would meet with Garrett again. The rumors would thicken. Malik would practice a speech and expect applause. But Zuri had placed measures long in advance. She had elected, like her grandmother, to be patient until patience yielded the right movement. There would be a moment at the gala where the story pivoted. It would feel like a technical glitch to those who had not read the ledger. For those who had, it would be an inevitable conclusion. Zuri did not desire spectacle. She desired correction. Night deepened. Zuri closed the kitchen drawer, the leather journal sheltered beneath her palm like a map to a hidden house. She did not sleep much that night, but she did not fret. She lay awake thinking of simple things, the smell of fresh earth after rain, the sound of her children's laughter the morning they thought an argument was nothing more than a bad dream. She thought of Mama Odessa's hand on her knuckle, and how the old woman had once said, "Buy slowly, hold long." The phrase had always sounded like a merchant's maxim. Tonight it felt like a stranger's prayer. When the sun rose, bringing with it the small, unavoidable brightness of an ordinary day, the world seemed not yet ready for the shock Zuri would deliver. But she had found in scent of red clay and in the dry sound of paper the confidence to proceed. The administrative instruments were in place, the proxies signed, the communications drafted. She had made choices not about revenge but about allocation. The dining room where Celestine had demanded the ring back had not yet seen the resolution it sought. The ring itself sat in a small silver tray in Zuri's bedroom, untouched and ordinary. The story Celestine favored was loud and simple. The story Zuri would write, quiet and durable, had only just begun to unroll. She dressed that morning in a dress that was neither ostentatious nor invisible. Burgundy, honest, a color that read like the underside of ripe fruit. It was a decision not of vanity, but of fit. She kissed the children, put the note she had written inside their lunchboxes, and tucked the leather journal under her arm. The next moves were administrative and careful, and the first step was to attend a board meeting disguised as a gala invitation. The house outside still smelled faintly of the lemon peel Celestine had used for garnish. The city moved on oblivious, in the comfortable bustle of people who have no idea that small shifts in paper can topple a throne more effectively than any shout. Zuri closed the front door and felt the cool metal of the knob under her palm. She walked away from the house with the same steady step she had used to cross farmland as a girl, knowing that a chain can be bought one link at a time, and once bought, it can hold a weight that none of the party guests had contemplated. She did not tell anyone about the proxies that had been signed. She did not boast about the trustees she had met in rooms that smelled of old coffee and better intentions. She simply proceeded, as Odessa had taught her, with the quiet arithmetic of a life that intended to last. The chain she had purchased was not jewelry to be flashed at dinner. It was infrastructure. When she reached the car, she paused and closed her eyes for a second, feeling the sun warm her face. She thought of the ring on the silver tray and of Celestine's satisfied face at the table. She thought of how small and theatrical that demand had been in the face of an entire chain of ownership she had quietly placed into position. The thought did not make her gloat. It made her steady. This is where patience ends and action begins. She started the engine and drove toward a room full of lights and cameras, carrying with her the slow, unshowy instruments of change. She parked 2 blocks away, as she had when she wanted to be observed as little as possible. The gala's valet line shimmered with sequined coats and patent leather. The building itself was a washed stage of marble and light. Up close, everything looked planned. The floral arches, the men in bow ties who wore the same practiced expression of admiration they gave to any polished speech. Zuri walked through it like someone moving under a magnifying glass, close enough to be seen, distant enough to be assumed harmless. Inside the ballroom, the air smelled of perfumed guests and the faint burn of 2 bright bulbs. A band played something clean and non-committal. Cameras pivoted toward the head table where Malik was already rising for his introduction, his hair threaded with confidence and sweat. Adzi fluttered in a cloud of laughter 2 seats away, the chair between them ceremonially empty where Zuri's place had once been in other photographs. Celestine smiled the way a person smiles when she believes a scene is performing exactly as she has scripted. Zuri found a seat at the edge of the room, tucked against a pillar where a waiter might not notice her with his tray. Her dress was burgundy, an inward color. It read neither like protest nor consolation. It read like deliberate fit. She set the leather journal, now a familiar weight in her lap, and smoothed the page markers that poked like planted flags through the edges. She watched Malik begin, heard the laudatory timbre of his voice rise, anecdotes about humble starts, about grit, about community. The screen over the dais began to play a montage. Childhood photos, a childhood home, collaborators praising his vision. It was the sort of video biography made for trophies. Zuri tilted her head like someone following the architecture of a tune. In the moment that the montage breathed, the projection changed. It did not change with the static violence of a hack or the dramatic flourish of a coup. It was, instead, the simple arrival of a different file into the machine. A corporate presentation designed for an investor meeting, full of charts and certified stamps. A careful title slide that read in block text the name of a holding company. The slide dissolved into an ownership chart, the kind of document accountants make to prove chain of title, and at its apex was a single name set in plain type. Zuri Odessa Namdi. Gasps travel in a room like small electrical currents. At first there was nothing but the tiny rustle of programs as people thought someone had made a mistake. Then there were phones pushed into palms, the clicking of screens. Malik faltered in mid-sentence, a picture stuck in the mouth of a man who had expected applause. A few people laughed nervously, like those who laugh when a play has a prop fall. Celestine's smile thinned, becoming a paper version of the satisfaction she had rehearsed. Dr. Lenora Owe stood before the microphone, having been introduced earlier as a patron and friend. She did not rush. Her voice was the kind that has practiced calm. It carried with the steady authority of someone who chairs boards and knows the tone of governance language. "We have verified these filings and have confirmed a chain of ownership that has legal force," she announced. There was no spectacle in the phrasing, no relish, no flourish, only the plain arithmetic of certification. The board has determined that the stewardship of these assets will be reallocated in keeping with the intentions expressed in the recorded instruments. Effective immediately, certain appointments will be recalled and funds reassigned to trustees attested under those instruments. The room inhaled, held its breath, then exhaled in 1,000 scattered directions. People did what people do first. They reached for their phones. Investors texted counsel. An editor in the gallery made a note to rewrite a column. Malik rose, voice shaking around the edges. He opened his mouth and found only plaintive fragments. Celestine's face transformed from triumphant to raw surprise in the space of 3 beats. She looked as if she had been pushed off a familiar stage and landed in the wings of a play she did not understand. Zuri heard the words, as if from a distance. She closed the journal by instinct, and her hands showed no tremor. She folded the program, 2 neat folds, and placed it on the table. She did not stand. She did not make a scene. She merely met Malik's eyes for the 3 seconds that had become her measure of confrontation. His gaze, so often steady when the light suited him, fractured into a question that plastered his face. Who sold me this future? Mr. Clifton was not visible in the crowd at that moment. He preferred to work in the quieter rooms where papers bear weight without the glare. But his instruments were visible. Certified copies, a scanned affidavit with signatures that matched those in the leather journal, a register entry flagged with the date and the language of appointment. The audiovisual technician at the podium, when asked by a startled producer, explained that the file had been cued as part of a planned corporate announcement, authorized by a council in the run-up to the event. It was not the dramatic flourish Celestine had planned. It was a procedural shift, an exhibit of ownership made public at a moment that could not be easily undone. For those who understood governance, Dr. Lenora's announcement read like a sentence that takes away the scaffolding under a man's reputation. For the rest of the room, it felt like the sudden discovery that a set of props had weight. Cameras turned toward Zuri as if asking her to explain what no one could believe. She smiled a fraction, and in that minute the room looked again at her, and found that the person they had been rehearsing to ignore was the one who had quietly done the accounting. The first administrative blows were immediate, because the networks that support reputation are already tethered to instruments of money. A representative from a lending consortium, who happened to be in the audience, received a call during the announcement and excused himself. Within an hour, an email was dispatched by a corporate bank asking for confirmation of signatory changes. Its language was careful and dry, the sort of language that implies holds, but does not shout them. A not-for-profit that had pledged sponsorship requested an audit of its grant agreement. A sponsor whispered to an associate, and the association in turn began to withdraw an invitation. Malik made a feeble attempt at defiance on stage. His words fell like thin plaster. He spoke of love, of family, of an expression of partnership. But love cannot sign proxies or appoint trustees. The instruments that had been put in place by Odessa and preserved by Mr. Clifton had their own force. They behaved like architecture. If a keystone is removed, even if no one smashes a wall, the balance changes. Celestine retreated, not physically. She remained at the head table, red-faced. But the performance had been miscalculated. Her plan for a theatrical reclamation had collided with a different kind of authority. Records, certified filings, a paper route that runs quiet and long. Her allies in the room began to look at one another with the tentative brow of people who wonder if they had placed bets on the wrong horse. The social engine sputtered when it realized the prize it had been trying to fashion belonged, legally and structurally, to someone else. Adzi's smile thinned like a strip of ribbon. Her posts later that night, pictures from the gala, captions suggesting triumph, were shadowed by comments that carried the ordinary cruelty of curiosity. Did she really not know? How did she not see? But social attention is fickle. It lives in flashes and moves on. The administrative measures that now took root were not designed for viral outrage. They were designed to be durable. In the days that followed, the fallout resembled the slow work of weather eating away at exposed iron. A line of credit Malik had used to smooth cash flow received a hold pending review. A notice was sent to a foundation's treasurer and requested clarification about the provenance of certain contributions. Award committees paused, citing conflicts of interest pending a review. Invitations that had promised a platform dissolved into polite emails. Contracts that required a favorable reputation to maintain were reviewed and then allowed to lapse. The consequences were neither cinematic nor instantaneous. They trickled through ledgers and minutes and human caution until entire projects that had relied on the smooth functioning of social capital found themselves without the underpinning they required. Publicly, The narrative shifted with the steady certainty of newspapers printing a new lead. Reporters called for statements. Malik's PR team produced a note that read like someone trying to stitch a torn banner. Celestine, in interviews, insisted she had simply wanted what was appropriate. Her voice suggested a woman who believed in the shape of inheritance and saw its contest as her right. In private, she received a formal letter from Mr. Clifton outlining the certainties of the transfers, language methodical enough to be painful. The letter made a small calibrating point. The instruments were written, they were valid, they required compliance. The sting in that script cut farther than any scandalous headline. Garrett, the private investigator Celestine had hired, found himself commodified by the sweep of documents he had not looked for. He had uncovered photos and receipts and little narratives. He had not found a single central ledger that would bolt the story onto a clean conquest. When he realized that best-in-show evidence could be a chain of trusts whose signatures rested under the name Odessa, he felt the small nausea of a craftsman who had prepared a frame for a painting that was no longer on the wall. The retainer that had bankrolled his weeks of searching was, like so many other things, quietly allowed to end. Mr. Clifton wrote no op-eds. He moved in rooms that smelled of ledger paper and cold coffee. His satisfaction was measured in completed forms and the silence of offices that had been instructed on procedure. He coordinated the recall of board appointments in 100 small emails and certified letters. He did not gloat. He checked a box and sent another notice. Each mail receipt was a small administrative victory. Dr. Lenora, whose name in the public eye had been associated with patronage and prudent stewardship, issued a statement with no ostentation. Funds would be redirected to a trust to provide support for children and mothers, to finance land stewardship and education initiatives that mirrored Odessa's stated priorities. When she read her statement to a local press pool, she did not frame the action as retribution. She framed it as fulfillment. These are funds that will be used for the purposes they were intended to serve, she said, voice steady as a ledger entry. Wherever there has been confusion, it will be clarified. Where there has been assumption, the record will speak. Some of Malik's collaborators called him in the weeks after the gala, voices that sounded like the caution of people who measure risk in spreadsheets rather than in loyalty. He answered with charm and clumsy persuasion. He offered guarantees that now looked more like promises than assets. In rooms where money moved at scale, charm is seldom sufficient. Banks want covenants, not charisma. There were pauses and polite declines. The man who had been celebrated for his vision found doors closing in the most prosaic ways. An underwriter asking for updated financials, a sponsor asking for a board resolution, an issuer asking for a certified signature. The things that make companies run, credit, payer relationships, endorsements, began to require documentation that could not be supplied by charm alone. Adzi stopped posting with the same frequency. The smile she had learned as a tool became less like a mask and more like a costume. Invitations to panels that had once seemed natural were routed through PR firms for vetting. She began to be treated like a figure who had been placed in an argument not of her making, and step by step she drifted from the scenes she had occupied. The public is curious but not patient. It will leave a prop at the center of the table if the show no longer serves it. Celestine called Zuri once after a fundraiser, where the air had been heavy with the hum of speculation. Her voice was gilded with righteous anger at first, and then grew smaller as facts were noted. She argued that she had been denied the satisfaction of reclaiming a visible token, that the ring was symbolic of her family's continuity. Zuri listened the way she always had learned to listen, without interruption, with the habitual patience that is sometimes mistaken for passivity. She spoke firmly but not unkindly. The instruments had been put where they would be durable. They were not symbolic. They were operative. Celestine's tone shifted into something almost private. Regret, perhaps, at having misassigned the shape of power. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There was a letter later, formal and brief, acknowledging receipt of notices and expressing her sorrow that a family conflict had spilled into the public domain. When the dust settled into what could be called normal life, Zuri did not appear on talk shows. She did not parade documents to cameras. Her acts had been designed for permanence, rather than for spectacle. Still, there were moments that tasted like small triumphs precisely because they were quiet and meaningful. a scholarship disbursement that deposited funds into accounts for girls in a county that had no such support, a land trust meeting where a parcel long threatened by subdivision was formally petitioned into protection, an endowment set up for mothers returning to the workforce, named not with flashy plaque, but with the plain language of purpose. Her children noticed some changes. Their calendar was less crowded with public appearances, their mother more present at the dinner table. Zuri's approach to them did not alter. She remained the one who packed lunches with a neat script and who read aloud in the narrow little hours before sleep. To them, the world's dramatic swings were a backdrop to scraped knees and piano lessons. That ordinariness was part of her aim, to make sure the life beneath the headlines remained steady. One morning, months after the gala, a letter arrived at Celestine's house by certified mail. It was short and composed without flourish. Mr. Clifton had written on behalf of a reconstituted board, politely explaining changes in trusteeship and the immediate redirection of discretionary funds. The letter included a paragraph that read like a small accounting of what Odessa had intended: stewardship, land care, and support for mothers and children. It concluded by noting that the trust instruments were legally binding. Celestine placed the letter on her kitchen table and, for the first time in many weeks, sat with it alone. She found that her appetite for social triumph had been replaced by a quieter calculus. Where had her time gone? What had been lost in the pursuit of spectacle? The letter did not humiliate her so much as it asked her to reckon. She did not reach for a statement. She sat, and the color drained slowly from her face. Mr. Clifton, meanwhile, dealt with the small administrative rebellions that always accompany change. There were trustees who protested the recall, and then, when faced with the legal documents that made their retention untenable, tendered resignation. There were accountants who rerouted payments and ministries that adjusted their budgets. The work was procedural and therefore effective. A web of small, technical acts that cumulatively redefined access. Garrett, finishing his retainer, paused more than once in the weeks after to wonder at how much he had missed. He made a call to a mutual acquaintance of Zuri's and found his own assumptions quietly corrected. He had been hired to find the visible wrongdoing. He had not been asked to look at the patient accumulation of ownership, a pattern he had not been trained to prize because it did not thrill the eye. He left a small note at the last address he had for Celestine, an awkward apology for not having found what she had hoped for. The investigator who had once thrived on the excitement of a scoop found himself undone by the prosaic power of deeds and signatures. Zuri continued her life with the steady stitch of daily responsibilities. She convened a small council with Mr. Clifton and Dr. Lenora to design scholarships that would directly serve communities she had grown up in. She asked for transparency and scheduling that would not allow funds to be used as social props. She insisted that audits occur in public forums with representation from village councils where the land trusts would operate. Her decisions were not dramatic. They were surgical and forward-looking. When an interviewer asked her months later if she had felt vindicated, she laughed softly and said that vindication had never been the point. The interviewer pressed, asking whether she had wanted people to see what had happened. Zuri looked at the question with the patience of someone accustomed to having words misapplied. "I did not want people to see me win," she said. "I wanted the things my grandmother cared for to be properly stewarded." It was not a boast. It was a redirection of attention away from her and toward the structures she had preserved. Adzi rebuilt herself in quieter venues, panels on lifestyle and brand building rather than family columns. Her trajectory shifted from being the center of a social moment to becoming an entrepreneur whose work was smaller in scope, but more directly controlled by contracts and deliverables. That move, while not always comfortable, was a lesson in sustainability. The bright accessory who once occupied a place at a table learned, like so many people who have been taught to perform, to anchor her success in things that cannot be casually repossessed. Malik, for his part, found that charm has limits against institutional scrutiny. His work faltered in rooms where investors wanted audited statements and conservative counsel. There were long arguments. He attempted to parachute into smaller ventures. Some took him, some did not. He and Zuri negotiated custody arrangements calmly and with the presence of counsel, and while the legal motions were clinical in their language, the children's steady care remained the household center. There was no sensational confrontation in the weeks that followed, no public exclamations of recrimination. Instead, there were meetings, mediated sessions, and the ordinary calculus of co-parenting when hearts and reputations have been bruised. Months after the gala, Zuri returned to Georgia. The land greeted her with the same honest smell of red clay and cut grass, its fences low and practical. The house there had the slow geometry of a place that had been lived in for generations, not a museum, but a home. She walked barefoot along the field that had once belonged to Odessa and felt the soil warm and resist beneath her soles. The children raced ahead, their laughter scattering over the grass like loose coins. The journal, closed for a long while, rested in the crook of her arm, its leather warmed by the sun. She sat at the edge of the field and opened the journal once more, not to find new instruments, but to close a chapter. In the margins she made a small note on how to distribute a parcel of land for community farming. She sketched a simple plan for an education fund and wrote down names of local leaders to speak with. Her handwriting was deliberate. Each word was a decision. Beside the journal lay a small silver tray where the ring had been set months before, untouched. She picked the ring up and turned it in her fingers. It was ordinary, a piece of metal with a history, a memory of a rooftop and a younger conviction. The children called her name and ran back as if to announce something urgent and bright. She rose, closed the journal, and pressed it to her chest for a second, the way she had seen Odessa press it once upon her knuckle. The action was small and private. She did not lift it in triumph. She wrapped it in oilcloth, an old habit that speaks to the care of things rather than their display, and slid it into the back of the drawer where deeds and small signed instruments lived. Walking toward the house, she felt the soil under her feet, the slow hum of roots and the steadiness of having built something that endures. A neighbor greeted her, and she exchanged the regular courtesies of a place that keeps calendars for harvests and school functions. It was the kind of life Odessa had wanted. Things organized, responsibilities met, a harvest that came back in seasons. She did not think of the gala much anymore. It existed like a footnote, a spectacle that had resolved into the patient mechanics of stewardship. That evening she sat at the kitchen table, the children at her knees, and read from a small book that had belonged to Odessa. The words were plain and practical, about tending soil, about the rhythms of sowing and harvest, about the dignity of work that feeds others. The house smelled of soup. There was the habitual clatter of forks and a small earnest conversation about school projects and the day's discoveries. It was the ordinary scene of a life mended and steadied, quiet, profoundly enough. When she finally closed the leather journal for the last time, she slid it into a secure box and placed it on the highest shelf in a closet where deeds and certificates slept. The action itself was not ceremony. It was an accounting done. She sat on the stoop with the children at her feet and watched the sun lean down, coloring the field's edges gold. She thought of Odessa, and the way the old woman had taught her to not be counted by noise but by what she held. That understanding bent the future into a shape, steady care rather than spectacle, small acts that add up into structures that shelter. Celestine over time adjusted as well. The social calendar retained its small obsessions, but certain tables where she once presided had shifted. There were fewer front-page photographs of family triumph and more garden parties with quieter guests. She found a different kind of company, people who valued certainty over theater. She did not invite Zuri back to her table. There was no reconciliation framed for cameras. There was, perhaps, a private reckoning that accompanies those who have attempted to reclaim symbols without understanding the foundation underneath. On a late afternoon, the children ran ahead to a small church at the end of the lane, its white paint bright against the green. Zuri walked barefoot across the yard and felt the threshold in her soles. The church was small and honest. The congregation greeted her as if she belonged to the very soil they tended. She settled in a pew and closed her eyes for a moment, not in triumph but in a small gratitude for the life that had been returned to measured shapes. A life where priorities had been rearranged not by scandal, but by steady instruments. When the service ended, she took the children by the hand and walked back across the fields. The journal was left at home. The trust instruments had been turned to public good. She had redirected funds into scholarships that would sow for generations. into land trusts that promised not to be subdivided by careless profit seekers, into programs that would support mothers returning to work. She had quietly bought the chain rather than argued over the ring. There are many ways for a story to end. Hers did not close with a single dramatic flourish. It closed with a set of small, decisive acts that were administrative in the most human sense. Acts that arranged lives for the better, and that made it impossible for the old order of spectacle to reassert itself in the same way. She had chosen durability over applause. At the edge of the field she stopped, took the ring, a simple band she had kept in a drawer for months, and set it down on a flat stone. She did not throw it. She did not press it into the earth. She left it there, a small object that would be found by someone curious or by a child who liked to collect things. Then she rose and, barefoot and unadorned, turned toward the house where the children ran ahead, and the journal waited in the closet. She had been asked for the ring and obliged without spectacle. What Celestine had not known was that she had bought the whole chain. She had, quietly and without need of an audience, arranged the links so they could hold what mattered. If you enjoyed this story of quiet strength and patient justice, follow for more tales that honor dignity over drama,